All right, welcome into Carp's Corner here. We got a robust football slate here coming up this weekend. We've got college football playoff rankings released. We've got Odell Beckham Jr. floating around in the abyss. He hasn't been picked up yet. Cleared waivers. We'll get into that. Scott Frost is back. Dan Mullins is going to be back, but had to make some coaching moves and get into kind of what that means and where they were at and probably why that ultimately needed to happen. Some big games this weekend, some interesting lines surrounding those big games that we'll get into as college football season's really, really heating up. 3 weeks left till the end of regular season. You got championship weekend after that. The final college football playoff rankings coming out. I mean, we're really cruising, and this year's just flying by. In a first like normal-ish year, fans back in the stands, energy surrounding the games, and it feels pretty great. And speaking of that energy, we'll get into a little bit of the college football ratings for last weekend and always kind of what that means. And I always enjoy looking at this to kind of see who cares about college football around the country and what is the formula to kind of make that work. Starting off, Dan Mullins, head coach, Florida, uh, been under heat, hasn't been great, didn't look great against Georgia. You know, last year they're playing Alabama in the SEC championship. They play them right down to the wire. They had Kyle Trask. They look pretty good. They got Pitts. They were a very solid team. And this year they take a step back. And here's the issue with a school like Florida, the expectations there. Dan Mullins comes from Mississippi State. Mississippi State, if you go 10-2, the next year you go 8-4, not a big deal. That's not going to fly at Florida. That's not how it works. It's a blue blood program. The expectation is each and every year you're trying to go undefeated. You're trying to make sure you can beat Georgia. You better beat Tennessee at this point every year with how they've been playing. And then you better be able to compete with Bama or LSU from the West. Like that is the expectation. And so if you're not making the SEC championship, you should be knocking on the door at 10-2, 11-1. And ultimately, and if you think about this and being someone who's my age, who, you know, born in the early 80s, watching Florida under Steve Spurrier, watching, you know, Bobby Bowden, you saw what Miami was doing during that time with, you know, a number of coaches, you know, through the 80s, and then ultimately, you know, Butch Davis in the 90s into Larry Coker. Florida was it, man. They were at the top of the college football heap, and they were competing every year. They were really good. They had a playoff system like now. I mean, they probably would have been in the playoffs 2 out of every 3 years. And they were rolling through tons of NFL talent. They still have a lot of that talent. They're still ruling the state of Florida, but they're just not the same team that they've been. And I think, you know, a lot of that is probably some of the talent. Dan Mullen probably not recruiting quite as much. Rumored that he kind of wants to look around the NFL because, you know, recruiting's hard and it's a year-round game. But it's easier to be an average coach with great players than a great coach with average players. I know Dan Mullins understands that, but a lot of college coaches get burnout on recruiting. They think the grass is greener in the NFL and they want to try to get there. Maybe that's been Dan Mullins' play. Maybe that's been his plan. But he fires his O-line coach. He fires his defensive coordinator, Todd Grantham. And, you know, frankly, I played for Todd. You know, he was in Dallas. He was our D-line coach. I met with him when he was the D coordinator for the Browns, when he was coming back, when I was coming out for the NFL draft. You know, he's been at Georgia, you had a run there. You know, he's a really, really smart football coach. He might be too smart for his own good. And I think he probably knows that he's usually the smartest guy in the room. And, you know, that was always my, you know, problem with Todd, not problem, but I just watched, you know, Grantham coach in college. And I wondered, like, are these schemes too complex? Does he do things sometimes that maybe it's great on paper and it works with, you know, at the pro level, and it can work with some college teams, but do you really need to do that? Are you taking the best advantage of the talent that you have? At Georgia, he had a ton of talent. In Florida, he's had some talent. But here's the reality. Like, is it too complicated? Are you trying to outsmart yourself? And Todd he said he's a really smart and he's a really good football coach. But the numbers have to bear out, and you have to be able to utilize that talent and be able to get ultimately the most out of it. And that wasn't happening at Florida. You know, this year they weren't near as good as the expectations were. And I always say you don't get fired for failing to win. You get fired for not meeting the expectations or failing to meet those expectations. And so at a program like Florida with lofty expectations each and every year, you know, total defense, they're sitting there at 43rd. And I'm not a huge total defense guy. To me, it's not the be all end all metric. I'm more of a scoring defense, but still, 56th in scoring defense, about 24 points a game, and then yards per play. Like because there's going to be games where you play a lot of defensive snaps just because maybe your offense isn't on the field. Maybe it's more of a, high scoring game, but how are you on a per end, play in and play out basis? And 5.44 yards for the Florida Gators, near the bottom in college football, not nearly enough, or too much rather, not nearly good enough. So Dan Mullen's going to have to revamp that staff a little bit. We'll see if he's able to make the correct changes. We'll see if he's there after next year. When you fire coaches during the season, it's implied that you're coming back, but that it's only given you 1 year. And so we'll see what happens and where they go moving forward. Looking on to another coach who's made some coaching moves, and a guy who many thought might not be back after this year. He's been at his alma mater now for a number of years, and it seems like it should have been time to kind of turn the page and kind of flip things over. You're 4 years in. And I understand there's a COVID year in there, and things don't always necessarily work out, but you should be rolling here. You've got a lot of your own recruits. Things should be moving in a better direction. And all of a sudden now, what are they, 3-7? Assured that they won't be making a bowl game, even if they win out. Best they would be able to do is 5-7. So Scott Frost will not make another bowl game at Nebraska, and his career record there is 15-27. Really bad. Brought his whole staff over from Central Florida. Didn't have really any experience or a ton of experience recruiting the Big Ten, Midwest. It's a group of 5 staff. I'm all for bringing as many guys as you can, but you ultimately have to make the decision which guys are good enough to elevate with you and which guys aren't. And so he his third OC in the last 4 years, coming up. He's a guy who is heavily involved in the offense. He's involved with it a lot. The new AD, Trev Alberts, comes in. Alumnus there had to make a decision on what they were going to do. Now, with everything I just said, I think it was the right move to keep Scott Frost. He's got to recruit better. And this year's recruiting class is not great. There's a lot of players that he has brought in who are talented. You look at J.D. Spielman, now down at TCU. I mean, receivers going back to Kentucky, guys that are really, really talented players who could have helped this offense. Scott Frost was lamenting, maybe we wouldn't have lost some of these close games, because the reality is, of those 7 losses, 6 of them are 1-score games. And the most recent one to Ohio State was a 9-point loss. So they've lost to Ohio State. They've lost to Oklahoma. They've lost to Michigan. They've lost to Michigan State. And most of those games were coming down to the final drive. And heck, Nebraska even had a chance on a strip sack against Ohio State to potentially pull it out. And so, they're making all these moves. They're doing all of these things. And they're bringing him back. And I think that ultimately is the right decision. But it's do or die time now for Scott Frost. And you can have all the talent in the world that you want. And he's talked about maybe, talent would have prevented some of those games from being as close. But ultimately, with his return, he's going to have to make sure he gets these hires right, which will be tough, by the way, because people know the situation they're getting into. And it's probably not one with a high degree of job security. So coaches are going to look at that. And if they have a better option of going to a place with a coach that is established or is just getting there, and we're going to have 2, 3, 4 years to fill it out, versus potentially a one and done situation if they don't win, and then look at the roster, look at the talent that they have coming back. Is that something that you're rolling with? So there's a lot of issues that they're going to have to get sorted out. But they were close this year. They were close. Defensively, really good. They still have some things that they've got to get sorted out, but defensively, they're really good. They just have to find a way to get that offense going. And he made a slew of changes, and we'll see who he's able to bring in. And if there's anyone that he can bring in that's, close, familiar to the program, has a history with the program. Because if you look back on this, I mean, everybody wants to say, after Tom Osborne and Frank Solich, where did he go? I mean, Frank Solich wasn't great. He was 9-3, really good. Bo Pelini, very similar, brought it back after Bill Callahan. Mike Riley gets there. That thing goes in the crapper, and they haven't been able to kind of pull out of this thing. And I don't know. I'm afraid that Nebraska could be coming You call them museum programs, maybe even a mausoleum program. Like it's done and it's dead. It has a great history and it's very important to the history of college football. But what are the prospects of it moving forward? Scott Frost has basically a year to figure that out. I don't know if he's going to be able to get it done, but based upon what I saw with the losses this year, they're close. 4 top 10 losses. I think losing to Illinois at the beginning of the year rocked their world, and they had a hard time bouncing back and recovering from that. And frankly, that was a game that they needed to win, and they didn't. And they blew it at the end of the first half. So they've got to improve on the situational football. But I like basically assuring Scott Frost that he will be back next year, but he's got to do something with it. They gave him the ball. Now he's got to be able to go and get it done. Speaking of Nebraska, Ohio State, Nebraska, highest rated game in college football this last weekend. And not a ton of great games on the slate that were coming in. Some ended up being very competitive, but nothing in there that was going to be sit down, must watch, top 10 matchup stuff that you were looking at. Historically, some good games. But my formula for this, for ratings in college football, is this. Take the population base. Where are the schools located? How many people are in the state or region? Then we're going to multiply that by the amount of people in that region that actually care about football. What does that percentage look like that are passionate about the game, that love maybe their team and also like to watch other college football? SEC, the footprint there isn't great as far as population base, but a high GSF, a high give a crap factor. People care about it a lot, so they tune in to watch. And so the majority of the state are going to tune in to watch those games. Big Ten's the next place. The Midwest, large population base, some big cities there, big populous states, Ohio State, Michigan, Illinois, Pennsylvania, although some of that's the East Coast, but it's still Penn State heavy. You know, even a state like Minnesota, Minneapolis, big population base. In Nebraska, obviously not the most populous state, but they care a lot. And so people in those states, they care a lot. They have a lot of people that care. And so as we look through this, I'm like, man, outside of those two regions, how much do people really care about college football? A little bit in the ACC footprint, somewhat, because there's some overlap with the SEC. You know, you've got Oklahoma, Texas. Yeah, I think Texas is a big football state, so they obviously care. But you got Nebraska, Ohio State, 5.3 million. Then you have LSU, Bama coming in second, which was a really good game that, you know, didn't maybe you think was going to be huge spread, but obviously it was close, coming in at 5 million. And then all of a sudden now you get to Michigan State, Purdue, not really two blue blood programs like the other ones we just mentioned in some iconic matchups, but 4.4 million in a pretty compelling game that got stretched late. And then you've got Auburn A&M sitting there at 3.7, another SEC school, and then one in Texas with a big footprint there, more populous state. And then you finally see your first teams that are located out of those two regions. And with Oregon, Washington, what was turned out to be a pretty decent game. You know, I understand the time slots aren't great for that, but just the passion that West Coast, California's huge. People sit here and tell me all the time that there's all these athletes out there and people care, but no one really seems to tune in to watch. That's what's disappointing. I grew up in an era where I thought, you know, Stanford and Washington, Oregon, USC, UCLA, people filled up those stadiums. And now, you know, for the most part, unless it's Oregon, unless it's Washington, they're playing, or maybe Utah, people aren't going to the games and fewer people are watching them. Because the next game up is you have Indiana and Michigan, one blue blood program and another basketball school at 2.6. So those are your top games that are coming in this weekend. And only one resided outside of the footprint of either the Big Ten or the SEC. And that is no surprise why they have the best media deals. Passion times population base. People care in those two parts of the country. And, you know, there's some pretty decent games, but there were other good games around the country that, you know what, I guess just didn't draw the interest of many of the local residents there. Now we have the college football playoff rankings, the second ones that came in, and no one really looked all that impressive except for Georgia, who's looked great. I'll have something for you on them in a minute as far as what I think they're up against this week. Georgia at number 1, Bama at number 2. Bama obviously not looking great against an unranked LSU team. Talented, but LSU had chances to win that game and didn't. And then at 3, you had Michigan State. They obviously lose to Purdue. How far do they fall is always the question, because that kind of shows you what the rest of the top 10 is going to look like. So they fall down. Oregon bumps up. Ohio State bumps up. Cincinnati bumps up, just like traditional polling. Team in front of you loses. Those three move up. Now all of a sudden you have Michigan, who is sitting there before at number 7. And we're looking at the 6th slot. They just played Michigan State the week before. Michigan State lost to Purdue, who's now ranked, who wasn't at the time. Purdue's been a giant killer. They already beat Iowa earlier this year. And so they talk about head-to-head matchups and how important those things are. And that's what the committee is holding its hat on for putting Oregon above Ohio State. And then all of a sudden they go and they put Michigan above Michigan State, even though they both have one loss, and you just watched them play the week before. And so the committee is saying this, it's all eye test. Just say it's all eye test, because you pick different metrics for everything, and it's fine. But just call it all eye test. We believe these teams are better. And at the end of the season, we'll try to find data to sort it out. But these are the teams we believe are the best, because OU's undefeated. And you look at how good they've been in the past, and they're not getting the benefit of the doubt. Notre Dame's a one-loss team. It hasn't looked great this year. Their one loss is to Cincinnati. They're sitting there at 9. And then you got Okie State rounding it out at 10. So you got 2 teams from the Big 12, independent. And, really outside the Pac-12, it's Big 10 and SEC kind of sitting there at the top, with A&M lurking, and then Wake falling out with their first loss. And so it's all eye test. Just come out and say that. That's what you should say, Gary Barr. We looked at some metrics. We had some heated debates, but this is just basically what we think. And if you don't like it, create a better formula. Find a better way to do it. I wouldn't honestly mind if they went to a BCS system where it's more point-based. And if you expand the playoffs, that will eliminate some of the perceived biases that go into this. But you have to figure that out, and people will have to agree to it. And I don't know if it'll ever go back. Moving on to some of the games. Michigan traveling to Penn State this weekend. Michigan sitting there ranked very high, number 6. The spread you would think in that game would probably be Michigan -10, maybe. They're on the road. Penn State has 3 losses, but unranked. And one of their losses is to Auburn, who we're sitting there seeing who, is doing pretty well this year, even though they just lost to A&M. But, it's an even spread, a pick 'em game, essentially, right there. Maybe -1. It's been moving around a little bit. We'll see what it ultimately gets to when it comes down to kickoff time. But Michigan traveling to Penn State, big game. Michigan needs to win that to try to keep pace in the East and to hopefully preserve that great matchup the Saturday after Thanksgiving against Ohio State. Huge matchup in the Big 12. OU's been teetering there. They don't really have a ton of signature wins. Caleb Williams, they look like they're playing better. This will be their first time to actually add some meat to their schedule. And they have Baylor, they have Iowa State, and they have Bedlam, the final 3 games. They'll have a chance to significantly bolster it. They win those 3, they're definitely jumping into the top 4. And even if they win 2 of them, depending on how they look, I'm curious to see how much they move in that situation. But going to Baylor, 5.5-point favorites, 6-point favorites are Oklahoma. I think they win this game, but Baylor, I think, will give them a run for their money. I could see it being much, much tighter than the number, closer to a field goal game as they get through this, because Baylor is a very underrated football team this year, and they performed pretty well when they've needed to and looked good. So they've got them trending in the right direction, but that's a huge matchup in the Big 12. Biggest matchup I'm seeing in the SEC. You've got Georgia traveling to Tennessee. Georgia's 3-touchdown favorite. Georgia hasn't given up more than 13 points. Most they've given up to any teams this year, South Carolina and Kentucky. I think this is the game where that number gets cracked. I think Georgia runs up and down the field. They have an offensive day, but with how that Tennessee Volunteer offense, they play with tempo. I saw what they did to Bama, even though Bama hasn't been as solid on defense this year. I saw what they did to Bama. Josh Heupel's got them rolling. I think they might be able to hang 3 scores on Georgia, something that nobody's done this year, but I think Tennessee will be able to do that. I don't know if they can stay inside the number. I think this could still be something that's 56, points scored by Georgia, maybe, 42, 45, somewhere in there. But I do think Tennessee is able to get 3 touchdowns. I think that tempo, that pace, some of the issues on Georgia's defense with players missing, I do think that will come up to maybe haunt them a little bit. And that tempo that Tennessee plays with, if they can start to develop a rhythm, I think they might be able to put together 3 good drives ending in touchdowns, 17 to 21 points. I like them to do that and be the highest scoring team, for whatever that's worth, against the Bulldogs this year. Final game, Purdue, the Giant Killers ranked 19th, jumping back into the polls against Ohio State. Ohio State favored by 20. That's a big number for a team that can score a lot of points with Purdue. Ohio State has a secondary that can take it away, but they're going to have to go improve it. They're going to have to play much better than they did against Nebraska in the secondary. They'll have to get pressure up front, which I think they can. They have to control David Bell, their elite receiver. If he has over 150 yards, I know Ryan Day, Matt Barnes, Kerry Combs, they will be losing their minds because he is the player that stirs the drink for Purdue. He's really good. He's an elite receiver, and they have to slow him down. Double team him, whatever it takes. They don't have enough to beat you with the rest of it. And so I think that's probably the recipe for that. And so that kind of puts a bow on college football. OBJ news, clears waivers on Tuesday, 4:00. Talking to a couple of teams. You know, he has $7 million on his contract. They didn't knock that quite down as much as I thought they would. They didn't knock the rest of it off. So it's just a 1 year, half-year rental type situation. No one claims him on waivers. Looking potentially, Pete Carroll's been flirting with the idea of bringing him in. He's made some comments publicly that sound like he could allude to that. There's been reporting that potentially OBJ's people are talking to the Patriots. I think that would be potentially another good fit. I don't think the Saints have the ability to bring him in. Green Bay possibly could. That winning culture, that situation, I could see Bill Belichick bringing him in. You know what? If he doesn't fall in line in 2 weeks, you're done. You're out of here. And so it'll be interesting. But the irony of this is he left a team that's in the hunt to win their division. Team that won a playoff game last year. One of his good friends, Juice Landry's there, the winning culture. It's interesting to see why that didn't work out in Cleveland. It'll be a nice case study to see how he does the rest of the year and next season and what the Browns do moving forward as well, because it seemed like that should have worked. He's the elite receiver, the playmaker that they've been longing for. And for some reason, they weren't able to get that marriage to ever work and be successful. Maybe some of it's on Baker, but I think Baker's good enough to be able to lead a team to a Super Bowl. I'm not saying he's a top 5 quarterback, but I do believe that he has enough there. And when there's enough pieces surrounding him, that he'll be able to have success. But Brown's playing the Pats this week. So we'll see if they scoop him up beforehand and just, if nothing else, try to pump him for information. They're probably not going to want to pay him a lot because that's how Bill rolls. So we'll see how much Odell Beckham Jr. really wants winning and wants culture, because they have a pretty good young quarterback in New England. They've got a good defense. I think they need an elite explosive playmaker over the top. He could be that guy for New England should that thing ultimately happen. Well, that's all today for Carp's Corner. That is this edition of it. Appreciate you tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon.